I am very, very excited to be here. I'm going to tell you why I decided to do this and what's on my mind, and then I would love to answer whatever questions you may have. I came to Atlanta from rural Arkansas, where my folks still live, to go to Emory University on a scholarship. It's the only way I would have gotten to go to Emory. And I immediately fell in love with Atlanta and immediately became immersed in Atlanta history, because I'm kind of a history guy. So I used to go to services at Old Ebenezer when it was in the old sanctuary. I would walk down Sweet Auburn. I remember seeing Angels in America at the Alliance Theater. I just got deeply kind of immersed in Atlanta. And I took a course from Robert Franklin before he was president of Morehouse. And it was on Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X as theologians in their social movements. And that really spurred my interest in the cross-section between religion and social movements. So I ended up doing what anybody does who cares about that stuff. I went into banking. So I went straight to banking, and I worked for a couple of years. And I ended up then going to Harvard, and I got a master's in theology and a master's in public policy. And theology at Harvard is a Unitarian seminary. So there are Jewish scholars and Buddhist scholars and Muslim scholars and Hindu scholars and everybody in the same divinity school. And I, again, returned to religion and social movements. And this time I studied Gandhi. I went and studied King again. I studied Malcolm X again. I ended up studying Buddhism and environmentalism, all these intersections of religion and social movements. And then I did what any good theologian would do. I went to work for a management consulting group, Boston Consulting Group, because I had to put my wife through med school, because we had gotten married and she wanted to go to med school and she wanted to come back to Atlanta, where she's from Marietta, and we came back. She went to Emory Med School. And I worked there for a number of years, and one day, Shirley Franklin, who had used our firm and another firm for pro bono projects, called and said, does anybody over there know anything about civil rights history or museums? So there's a new idea about those. And the person said, we don't know anything about museums, and we got one guy who knows a lot about civil rights history, but he's 32 and he's white. Do you care? And she said, I don't want to pay for him. I don't care what he looks like. So send him over if he's free. And it was a 10-week assignment that took 10 years to build the Center for Civil and Human Rights. So I led that project from start to finish, the design, the fundraising, helping secure the King Papers, everything related to it. And then I got to, along the way, meet all my heroes. I got to meet everybody who I had studied, John Lewis and Andrew Young and Joseph Lowry and Evelyn Lowry and Juanita Abernathy and C.T. Vivian and all those incredible icons to bring their story to life. But I'd always promised myself, and I had told the board and everybody else, that when it opened, I would leave, because the project was too important for the person who played my role to stay too long, because it needed to be all of ours, and it needed to be about all of the movements. So in 2015, a year after it opened, I left. I went back to the private sector for a couple of years, and then I got tagged to be the CEO of the Woodruff Arts Center. And I spent 3 years at the Woodruff as CEO, both running the place, but also helping it diversify offerings, the board, the patrons, etc. And while I was at the Woodruff, and probably because I'd been involved in all these things with Atlanta, I started to feel about 2.5 years ago, the city starting to pull itself apart. And a couple of you mentioned that you were at an ADL event about 3 years ago, and I was kind enough to get an award that night. And I talked about this notion of that the city was starting to not invest in relationships in the same way that it had, and was not supporting institutions in the same way that it had. And it reminded me of a conversation that I once had with Andrew Young, and we were talking about the civil rights movement in Atlanta, and he said Atlanta's difference was that it built relationships before a crisis. Atlanta invested in those relationships before they were needed. And in Nashville and Memphis and Birmingham, they didn't have those relationships ahead of a crisis. They had to form them in a crisis. But in Atlanta, the political leadership and the religious leadership and the business leadership and the social justice leadership all knew each other before the crisis. And I started to see that we weren't investing in those relationships. And then, of course, the crises started to unfold. COVID, the economic crisis, crisis around social justice, the crisis around public safety even. And what have we seen? Have we seen Atlanta run towards the same table? Have we seen everybody say, hey, let's all meet up in the same place on Tuesday and solve these problems? We've seen people actually do the exact opposite. We've seen people talk about leaving the city. We've seen people not talking to each other across the lines that seemingly divide us. And so it got me thinking about moving into a political role. In addition, we are still growing very fast. We have enormous economic momentum still. Google's coming. Microsoft's making huge investments. Visa's putting 1,000 jobs in where Norfolk Southern's headquarters used to be, because Norfolk Southern just built a big building 6 blocks down the street. We see people moving here. We see housing prices going up. So we have enormous tailwinds economically. And yet, we came into COVID with 25% poverty. We came in with an infrastructure that's not very good at supporting the population we have right now. It's really not prepared for climate change. And yet we're going to add 100,000 more people, 200,000 more people, and we really don't have a plan for that. And so to me, this moment was a very, very crucial moment, because one, we're either going to rebuild those relationships and pull ourselves back together, or the city literally may split itself apart. And two, we're either going to grow in a different way, or we're going to grow in the same way, which is going to be much more challenging with a lot more people without those investments that we could make. Why the city council president role? The city council president role is a consensus builder. That is its fundamental duty, and that's its fundamental influence. It has to make the council work well together. It has to work well with the mayor's office and with the administration. It has to bring communities in. And when we've seen it done well, like Kathy Woolard in shepherding the Beltline when it was first presented to her by Ryan Gravel, and she really made sure that it was an idea that got life and that got momentum and that then got policy, it can be a transformative role. And when it's just bickering with the mayor, it can be a very, very challenging role. But to me, at this moment, we need someone who is very good at building consensus across the city, somebody who's very good at bringing communities into decision-making, and somebody who really has a policy desire, because I think the policy questions we face are really important. The other thing that's on my mind, everybody who's, I think, outside of politics who decides to do this crazy thing has something that makes them mad enough that they decide to do it. So I'm going to share with you my what made me mad enough story. So I told you my wife went to medical school. She's now an emergency room doctor at Grady. That's what she does. So I always lose the how was your day battle, because her day was always more challenging than my day. But she also works on HIV medicine. It's one of her specialties. And there's a program called HOPWA. Does anybody happen to know what HOPWA is? If you haven't been to an event before, you know what HOPWA is. He's in healthcare. HOPWA is Housing Opportunities for People with AIDS. HOPWA. It's a very simple program. The federal government sends money to cities. The city works with local nonprofits that subsidize housing for those living with HIV long term. We have had, for years, millions of dollars unspent sitting at the city of Atlanta while we have folks with HIV on a wait list. And during COVID, we've actually had them facing eviction from their housing because we can't seem to get the money that we have literally sitting at the city out the door. It's the same thing when it comes to workforce training. We've seen money not being able to be spent and actually sent back to the federal government. It's the same with transit dollars. It's the same with rental relief dollars during COVID. We can't seem to just operate fundamentally. I probably don't have to tell you, it's the same thing you see with yard trimmings. I've moved all around the city and people have quoted me in months how long their yard trimmings have been out on the sidewalk in front of their house because they haven't been picked up. It's the same thing. I met with a group of small business owners, all women, and they said they wait more than 6 months to have the bills that they send to the city for things they've done for the city paid. They have to wait 6 months for their bills to be paid. There's just an operating kind of ethic at the city that's not working right now. And so I also wanted to take the role of city council president to help the next mayor and the next administration. If they're interested in fixing these things, I want to bring my experiences of running big nonprofits and running businesses actually to help make that happen. And so to me, the three things are on my mind: how we're going to grow, how we're going to make sure that we're making those investments in infrastructure going forward, how we're going to really think about whether or not the entire city is benefiting from what's happening. And then finally, public safety. Public safety is on all of our minds. And I think there's a couple of things about it. One, public safety is a symptom of how healthy your city is. Fundamentally, if your city is healthy and people are engaged and neighborhoods are working, they are usually relatively safe. And if you fundamentally have parts of your city that are not working, you will often have an unsafe city. With 25% poverty, if we don't tackle that long term, we're never going to have the safe city that we want. But in the short term, there are some things I think that we need to do differently. Number one, we only incent our officers, if they have a college degree, an extra $3,000. The suburbs give them $5,000 to $10,000 more. The fire department actually gives every fire person $3,000 every year to increase their education. We don't have the same program at the police department. Why does it matter? One, means there's a whole bunch of people who are either college educated or want to be college educated as they move through their career, who we can't do a good job recruiting, and we're losing those officers. But even more so, 2 national studies showed that those with college degrees commit far less citizen violence than those without. So the kind of policing that we want is actually right there, but our incentives are not aligned. So we've got to make sure we've got those incentives. We've got to take the Denver model. We need more mental health specialists. We need more domestic violence specialists. We need to be able to send a different skill to a different kind of problem when it is called in. And this is exactly what my wife sees at the EDR, is that a lot of folks who end up in a police situation actually are having a mental health crisis. And we need to be treating folks for exactly what they are having. And then 3, there are some basic issues around making sure that lighting that we have installed works, because lighting makes people safer and it makes people want to walk around. If we've installed cameras, we need to have the budget to maintain them and to make sure that the technology is upgraded so they're actually working. We need to make sure that equipment works. A lot of times we've invested in equipment, but it's not actually working. And so we can't have just the kind of basic working of the departments, both fire and police. And also we have to make sure that everyone feels safe moving about. Because you get into a situation where when people don't feel safe moving about, walking down the street, eating out, going for shopping, then less people do it, it becomes less safe. Less people do it, it becomes less safe. And that's what we've seen in Buckhead, right? We've seen, and in Midtown, we've seen folks say, I don't want to go out. You have less people moving around. That means you're less safe, and it's a perpetual cycle. I live on 4th Ward near the East Side Beltline. There are thousands of people out there all the time, and that part of town has been much safer throughout COVID. So part of it is making sure that things like street racing are actually addressed, traffic calming measures are actually addressed, that we actually have ways in which folks can see that we're taking care of these things so that people actually feel better about going out. Because more people going out makes all of us safer. So I think there are things that we need to do around public safety, but it's going to take some time. And I think that we have to also work on those long-term issues. So those are the things on my mind. I will end by saying this. I have had the privilege of moving all over the city during this campaign. In 1 week, Jake Field right here, who's always with me on these events, Jake and I were in every quadrant of the city in the same week. And every quadrant of the city talked about and asked the same questions, had the same concerns, had the same hopes as every other quadrant. Now, most people can't see that because COVID and everything else, we're not moving around the whole city. But the good news is, for all the challenges we face right now, no neighborhood sees it differently. Everybody sees the situation very, very much the same, which means that if a leader or a set of leaders actually is comfortable moving across this whole city, there is a consensus to be built across this whole city for where we need to go. And there is a consensus for wanting to tackle the issues that Buckhead has raised and that Southwest has raised and that Ormwood has raised, because they're the same issues. And so the good news is there is really an ability to bring the entire city together to make a lot of progress on these things. So I am happy to answer any questions you may have, including about a little issue about Buckhead City that I heard may be bubbling up, if you want to talk about that, or anything else that's on your mind. But I want to just say I really appreciate you all coming out on a beautiful weekday night during early voting to hear me and to care enough about local politics to do this. So thanks for having me, and it's a real pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I may just break out in a song because we've already had some. I was listening to musicals on the way over here, no joke. So who knows what may come out of my mouth. Yes.
Yard signs.
There are yard signs, absolutely, right out in the front. You can take all you want, and we have stakes, and they are lovely. I can't tell you how many people I go someplace and they say, oh, I have a sign in your yard, my neighbor has a sign in your yard. It makes a difference.
Yeah.
So thank you. Yes?
I want to ask you about your work in Noodle Center.
Yeah.
I think that working on combination of musicians and performers and administration, it's a good training for politicians.
It is a good training for politicians.
And also knowing Franklin, I worked with him like 5 years before he moved. He was very interesting person, but he had like you, vision. But do you think that being with musicians and with educators help you to achieve your goals and to form your further goals?
Sure. So actually my father was a professional singer as well as being a preacher. My brother's a professional musician. I got none of those talents. They took them all. I just got the administrative talents. But I think there are a couple of things that I really have benefited from being around arts and culture. One is, I love a phrase that Susan Booth, who heads the Alliance Theater, uses, and that is that artists are great problem solvers, and not only for arts problems. Right? Artists have to solve all kinds of problems, right? A visual artist may also have a lot of knowledge about architecture, about construction, a set designer, and in the theater the same way. So I think one is I've really grown an appreciation around creativity and problem solving and how those two things really come together. The other thing I would say is in Atlanta, so much of our, what we think of as our legacy has a real cultural component to it, right? Civil rights legacy had an enormous amount of art involved in it. Obviously, a lot of that movement had come out of the African American church. Music was such a huge part of it. And so again, you can't take the history of the political side of the civil rights movement without understanding the music of the civil rights movement. I think when you also just look at Atlanta culturally, we have an incredible music legacy in all kinds of genres, across different genres. We have an incredible legacy around theater. Kenny Leon just won another Tony this year. And so I think what we're missing is that too often we basically take for granted the art sector without really making the investments, and especially making the investments across the whole of the arts sector. So we've made some investments, but we really haven't seen it for what it is. The arts sector, outside of film, would be as big an employer as Delta Airlines if it was considered a company. It is tens of thousands of people who work in the arts sector in the city of Atlanta, and even more in the region. And yet, we should be funding the arts at about $12 to $15 million a year, and we fund it at $2 million a year. The arts community here is very much kind of a bootstrap community. And I think there is an enormous amount of upside to us bringing more financial and just kind of support to the arts and culture sector, because it does benefit so many of the other sectors that we have and just generally benefits the city. I'll say one other thing on this. I think that Atlanta's big advantage going forward is our diverse workforce. We have Georgia Tech and Georgia State and our HBCUs and Emory and Agnes Scott and UGA up the road. We're producing such a wide array of talents and types of people that's why Google and Uber and Microsoft are moving here. They're moving here for that workforce. But if we don't get arts and culture right, when people move here, they're not going to stay here long term. Or when they graduate from here, they're not going to stay here long term. And so to me, there's a really interesting moment where if we make those investments around quality of life, and it's not just arts and culture, it's also parks and some other things which I'm happy to talk about, we can actually create a way in which we're an attractive city that can really retain all of that talent. If we don't make those investments, I fear that we may go back to the days in which people move here for a while and they start their career and then they move someplace else to quote unquote make their name. And I think that's what we really need to avoid when it comes to this cycle of our growth. Other questions?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Doug, what would you say to a young black parent voter that would somehow send a message to them that you have any business being the city council president?
So if you didn't notice, I'm a white guy. I'm also Christian and straight. And so I am in some ways an unlikely city council president. I think that what we have to understand is this city has issues that need to be addressed very, very significantly. Issues of poverty, issues of access, issues of economic mobility. There is a zip code in the west side of Atlanta that has a 20-year less life expectancy than a zip code 3 miles away. The zip code with less expectancy is almost exclusively black population. 23 miles away is almost exclusively white population. I can't change who I am, but I can use everything that I have to tackle those issues and to make sure that everybody in this city actually has the ability to build the life that they want. I would also say that as a white guy who led the building of the Center for Civil and Human Rights, I had to build relationships across lines of race and religion and generation as a younger person, building the story of those who had come before me. And I believe that both those experiences and my skills and my focus on making sure that folks who have been left out aren't left out is exactly what we need, and is also exactly what I will offer in this job. And so to me, I believe that at this moment, the question before us is, are we going to have a city council president who is actually going to make Atlanta better for everyone or not? And it doesn't really matter what someone looks like on that question. It matters how it is that they're going to tackle those issues. Hi, welcome. Yeah, mini box.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
We got kids coming up.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah, Minnie's got one.
Okay, good. All right.
First, I want to say I'm so excited to be here at Molly's house again and see so many familiar faces, old friends and neighbors. But I also want to share with you that I've been a supporter of Doug since I first learned that he tossed his hat in the ring, because I also, like Molly, have known and followed what Doug is up to next. So, but with that being said, Doug, yesterday started the early voting, and I wanted to ask what the campaign is doing regarding the GOTV effort, because my biggest concern now is seeing all the signs about the Buckhead secession, that these people are not going to be motivated to vote. And I'm very concerned about that, and it's really upon all of us, I know individually, to talk to our neighbors to say, this is so important for everybody, whether Buckhead, it becomes a city in itself or not. This is so important for all of us. But I'd like to know more about what you and the campaign are doing to address the GOTV to get those folks out.
So Mindy and I have done a lot of good trouble things together. We did some work with a certain senator, now Senator Ossoff, before he was senator, trying to get him elected. And Mindy threw a wonderful event like this for me a few weeks ago. So our whole campaign strategy, this is about the 85th or 90th event like this that we've had now. Our whole campaign, and I've knocked on several thousand doors myself. Our team has knocked on tens of thousands of doors over the last few months. Our whole campaign strategy has been to be 1 degree separated from everybody in the city. If you haven't seen us, somebody who you know has seen us, has asked their question, has been at an event, has seen somebody in our t-shirt or me on their front porch. And so obviously we built a database of all of those folks, and we've built relationships with all of those folks. So first and foremost, our GOTV effort is to get all of those folks not only to vote, but to talk to other folks who are in their network and say, hey, it's time to vote, and I know somebody. Because see, what happens is you've all been talking about the mayor's race. I know you have. Don't lie. You've all been talking about the mayor's race. And you may have been talking about some other race that's down the ballot, school board race that you care about, or a lot of folks have a district race. And city council president race sort of gets left out. And so part of it is activating all of those folks we've touched to say, hey, I'm going, and I need you to go too. That's one. Two, there are efforts in various neighborhoods, including Buckhead, just to turn out the vote. There are actually several efforts underway. New Georgia Project has actually canvassed my door twice, and I'm a super voter, to say, hey, just get out and vote, nonpartisan. There's a whole effort in Buckhead. You may have seen the Buckhead counts, right? You've seen that. That's all over. And so there are others in other parts of the city. So there are independent efforts that are pushing people to get out the vote. 3, we have some very specific efforts around getting folks out. We had efforts around registration. Now we have very specific efforts around getting folks out to vote, to make sure that they understand. But I will tell you, the reason why this is so important tonight, there are still a whole bunch of undecided people in this race. There are still a whole bunch of people that literally within the next 3 weeks are going to decide who they're going to vote for. So the most important thing you can do to help me, if you think that I'd be a good city council president, is don't keep it to yourself. Send an email. Sit down with other folks. You can turn into 5, 5 can turn into 25. Because literally, I talked to somebody today, he sent me an email. He said, I got a question about something that, he just sent it to the regular account. I got a question about something Doug thinks. So I called him. I said, hey, Mr. So-and-so, this is Doug Shipman. He said, I didn't expect a call. I just thought somebody would email me. I said, well, I got 5 minutes. We talked, and he said, I've never been undecided this late in a campaign. I always vote, and I always usually know, and I don't know now. And so it is really, really important, not only that people get out to vote, but that we talk to them about the campaign. But I will say, because they're undecided, they also might not vote, because they might just say, you know what, I can't decide. And so this really is incumbent on everybody. We're doing all we can as a campaign, but all the people we've touched, that really is going to be the magic of making sure that it happens. Let me wrap up by saying, I really have never seen, in my 30 years of being in Atlanta, and even in studying Atlanta and bringing it to life in a museum, I've never seen what is usually an optimistic city, this questioning of its future. Never heard that quite that tone. It reminds me a little bit of what I read about in the 50s, when the civil rights movement first started, and there was a lot of consternation about where Atlanta was headed. This was right at the end of Hartsfield's term and right when Ivan Allen Jr. came to office. But I also know there's a consensus of what people want. And so even though at the moment there is a lot of uncertainty, I truly believe that if we have leaders who are willing to go out, to roll their sleeves up, to really work on the nitty-gritty stuff, that there is an overall consensus of where the city needs to go. But it is going to take a whole lot of work in a short amount of time. And I would simply offer that I am willing to do that work. And I'm willing to do it every day. And I'm willing to not do it just at City Hall, but I'm willing to do it in every neighborhood in this city. And I really appreciate you all giving me a chance to share. And it would be an honor to have your vote. Thank you very much.
Just as long as you stand by.
It was.
This was
Darling, stand by me. Whoa, stand by me. Won't you stand?
You don't have any energy.
Stand
Hi, Jenna. How are you? Hi.
when the sky should tumble and fall, and the mountains should crumble into the sea.
This was our first dance wedding song.
I won't
So
cry.
sweet.
No, I won't
Oh, Shannon.
Grandma's mastered the dance.
shed a tear.
Wonderful.
That long
Sweet.
as you stand.